Hi everybody, and welcome to the new Mindscape. In this video, I'm going to be talking about imagining spiritual reality after death and before death. The power of your imagination allows you to imagine yourself beyond your body, in another world. You can imagine yourself living in the distant past, living in another country, living in the future, or living in another world after your physical death. Life after death can be neither proven nor disproven. But there's one fact, which is that all societies and religions have an imagination of life after death, and that this imagination has implications. When we discuss the issue of life after death, we can only use our imagination. Even if there is such a thing as life after death, it would be impossible for us to conceive of it, so we can only imagine it. The material world is the world of space-time. So, beyond the material world, can we even speak of space and time? Without framing our vision in space and time, how can we even imagine anything? So, even if life continues after death, our understanding of such a process can only be aided with our imagination using images, symbols, and metaphors that are derived from this material world. And they could never be more than an approximation of a reality that is beyond the mind's ability to comprehend. So, how do different religions imagine life after death? All religious traditions use images and metaphors based on life here in order to imagine life after death. Some of them imagine life after death to be essentially a reflection of this life, and Chinese folk religion is a good example of that. So that's why you want your ancestors to have cars, mahjong tables, to have a nice house in the afterlife, and so on. And just like here, that afterlife seems to have social hierarchies, judges, corrupt officials, and so on. So you live in the afterlife just as you lived here. There's no big change. Other religious traditions imagine life after death to take place in a spiritual world that operates differently from our world. These religions have different kinds of imaginations, conceptualizations, symbolizations, and rituals in relation to death, but there is something in common throughout all of them. They consider that beyond the visible material reality, there's another spiritual reality. Beyond this material reality, which you observe with the senses, there's something else. And this spiritual reality is described in many different ways. It's described with all kinds of complex symbols, but maybe it can be simplified in a certain way, by talking about two poles of this spiritual reality. So, different religions often conceive of spiritual reality as extending between two poles. At one end, there is a state of bliss with absolute and perpetual joy. And this is also a state of oneness, of love, of truth, clarity, pure consciousness, nearness to the divine, and reunion with God. All of these features can be described as pure light or as heaven. So this is the positive pole of the spiritual reality. And there's the opposite side of the spiritual reality. And this is described as a state of deep spiritual suffering, confusion and separation, loneliness and isolation, ignorance and loss. So this can be described as darkness or as hell. Now, often the spiritual reality is imagined as a physical place, and other times it's understood as a spiritual state. So if we take the terms heaven and hell literally, so then perhaps you could understand heaven as a particular place where I suppose you could fly to in an invisible rocket flying up to some place in the universe, which is called heaven. Or you could go underground to some big pit in the center of the planet called hell. So these are literal, physical imaginations of heaven and hell. But on the other hand, symbolic or metaphorical interpretations or spiritual understandings take these terms, such as hell and heaven, as metaphors for a spiritual condition. In that sense, heaven is a spiritual condition of purity, closeness, and blissful joy. Hell is a spiritual condition of pollution, loneliness, and suffering. So these different states are conditions of the spirit. The spirit is attracted to purity, love, oneness, and divine qualities. So for the spirit to be in such a state, or to be close to such a state, is truly heavenly. That's absolute heaven. But to be far from such a state, to be far from what it most truly and deeply desires, well, such a condition is a condition of hell. So our imagination of heaven and hell can actually then tell us something about our own spirit. What is the spirit? Beyond our material reality, beyond what we perceive with our body, the things we own, or the words and labels by which we describe ourselves, there's something else. In a previous video, I discussed the idea of our true self, what in Taoism is called the uncarved block. What will happen if we strip away everything that we can see and describe about ourselves? What would happen if we even strip away the body? What remains in the view of religions is our spirit or our soul. Different religious traditions have different names to designate the spiritual reality of the human being. So, for example, in Buddhism, it's often said that there's no soul, but Buddhism also states that all sentient beings have a spiritual nature, which is called the Buddha nature, or the 佛性. In other terms, you have our divine nature, our heavenly nature, our spiritual nature, and so on. So no matter what the term is, and the variations of the nuances and the meanings of these terms in different religious and philosophical traditions, all major religions consider that our spirit or our spiritual nature is the most essential aspect of the human being. Religious teachings consider that our spirit is attracted to the heavenly state. It yearns for that state of bliss, of consciousness, knowledge, and oneness. The life of the spirit is a journey towards that heavenly state while trying to avoid the hellish state. The heavenly state is where the soul is true to itself, true to its essential reality. On the other hand, in the state of hell, the soul has forgotten what it really is. It has turned away from its own nature. It's been attracted to other kinds of things, to power, to fame, and to wealth. to the desires of the body and of the ego, which draw it away from its true nature and lead it to ultimate suffering, especially after death, when it can no longer have these things. When in a spiritual reality it can no longer have money, power, and wealth. So the soul is on a journey, attracted to the heavenly state and seeking to avoid the hellish state. And this is a journey in which there are causes and consequences. Different religions teach that pure motives and deeds will lead the soul closer to its own true nature and heavenly state. Pure motives and deeds will help to purify the soul, making it more heavenly. While on the other hand, the soul will suffer from impure motives and deeds. It'll be corrupted by these deeds, bringing it closer to a hellish state. So this is the whole idea of the Chinese saying that goodness brings good rewards and evil will bring evil rewards. 善有善报,恶有恶报. Now, a lot of people understand this in a material sense, and so they wonder, why is it that sometimes a good person suffers material infortunes and even injustice, and why a bad person may enjoy material fortunes. But if we understand it spiritually, this spiritual law operates at a spiritual level. Goodness brings spiritual benefit to the soul, and evil brings spiritual damage to the soul. So a lot of people with a lot of material wealth and power are spiritually living in a hellish state. And a lot of people who don't have much material fortunes, but their spirit lives in a heavenly state. So it's interesting that I began by talking about life after death and about the notions of heaven and hell after death. But then after imagining that, and after imagining heaven and hell as spiritual conditions, I ended up talking about heaven and hell in this life. The imagination of life after death, the imagination of a purely spiritual life, has helped us to understand something about the spiritual dimension of this life. In different religious traditions, it's said that egoism and the attachment to the body will block the progress of the soul. And so these attachments make us more selfish. We want the things of this world, and we become more attached to the world. And so when we leave this world, we find ourselves in much pain, being torn away from those things, those material things that we're so attached to. But if we're more detached from this world, we won't be much affected when we leave, and we'll be fine to leave behind our material possessions and our social position. So as the soul progresses spiritually, it becomes less attached to the ego and to the material world. It becomes more conscious of the spiritual reality. It becomes more conscious of the interconnectedness of all things. It feels joy at the joy of others and pain at the pain of others. It has a stronger urge to connect to the divine reality. It has a stronger urge to help and to nurture suffering souls. This is the path of spirituality. And along this journey we go through the passage of death. This is an important stage in the life of the soul. One metaphor is that the soul loses its shell, just like you take the clothes off your body. If the soul is too attached to the ego and to bodily life, it will feel an incomparable pain from being torn away from everything it loves in this world. But if the soul has progressed and become attached to spiritual reality, to spiritual qualities, it will continue to progress, leaving the material world behind and entering the purely spiritual reality. This soul will be liberated at the point of death and enter a blissful state. In some religious sayings, our body is compared to a seed. As our soul grows, the husk of the seed, our body, needs to break and fall off. And then the soul can grow into its fullest flourishing like a flower growing out of its seed. Sometimes the gardener will pull the small seedling out from one place and plant it somewhere else. The seedling has disappeared from this garden, but it's been planted into a more beautiful garden where it will fully grow and develop. So maybe from the perspective of the dead person, there's no pain whatsoever, and in fact, maybe she went off to someplace better. So the idea here is that our basic nature and essence is our spirit. The body imposes some constraints on the soul. Death implies moving on to another dimension in which we're released from the body. All of our spiritual capacities can have greater development as we move into the next phase, after inhabiting and growing in this body.